The last thing Molly remembered before her world collapsed was the smell of lavender. It came from the small sachet her mother had sewn into the lining of her winter cloak years ago, back when the world still made sense, back when she still had a mother to sew things for her. The gray wool held that scent like a secret, releasing it only when Molly pressed the fabric close to her chest, which she did now. Standing in the corridor outside Lord Devren's study, her fingers knotted together so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. She had been summoned. That alone was strange. In 3 years of living under Lord Devren's roof as his ward, Molly had never been summoned to his private study. She was managed from a distance, like an inconvenient piece of furniture that had been inherited along with the estate. She ate in the servants' hall when the household forgot to set her place at the main table. She slept in a room at the far end of the east wing, where the cold came through the walls in winter, and the mice came through the floorboards in spring. She was tolerated, occasionally remembered, and mostly ignored. That was the arrangement. She had accepted it because she had no other choice. She raised her hand and knocked. Enter. Lord Devren was standing with his back to her when she pushed open the heavy oak door. The study smelled of burnt tallow and old parchment, and the fire in the stone hearth had been stoked high despite the mild evening. 2 candles flickered on the writing table, casting unsteady light across the maps and sealed letters scattered across its surface. Molly noticed, without meaning to, that one of those letters bore a wax seal she recognized, the crowned wolf of the Royal Lycantian court. Her chest tightened. "Close the door," Devren said without turning. She did. He was a tall man, Lord Devren, with silver threading through his dark hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that power did not need to be announced. He had been her father's closest ally, his sworn brother in the old tongue, the man who had wept publicly at her parents' funeral and privately arranged to have himself named her legal guardian within a fortnight of their deaths. She had been 22 then, old enough to know something felt wrong, not old enough to understand what it was. She understood now. "Sit down, Molly." She sat in the chair across from the writing table, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. She had learned stillness, too, in her own way. It was the kind of stillness that came not from power but from practice, from 3 years of making herself small enough not to be noticed, not to be resented, not to give anyone a reason to look too closely at her. Devren finally turned. His expression was composed, almost kind, which frightened her more than anger would have. "I have arranged a marriage for you," he said. The fire crackled. Molly kept her face still. "A marriage. To Lord Fenwick of the Northern Reaches. The contract has been signed. You will depart in a fortnight." He said it the way a man announces the weather, flat, certain, already decided. Something cold moved through her. "You signed a marriage contract on my behalf without my knowledge. I am your guardian. It is my right. Lord Fenwick is 53 years old. She had met the man once, at a harvest feast 2 autumns past. She remembered his hands most clearly, the way they moved when he spoke, restless and proprietary, reaching for things that did not belong to him. Devren's expression did not flicker. He is wealthy, established, and willing. Willing. As if that were the only quality that mattered. As if she were a parcel to be delivered to the first man who agreed to accept the postage. "I see," she said quietly. She stood. She kept her movement slow and deliberate, because her legs were not entirely steady, and she refused to let him see that. "You will have time to prepare," Devren said, already turning back to his letters. "Marta will help you sort your things." Molly walked to the door. She placed her hand on the iron latch, and then she stopped, because something made her stop. Not thought, not decision, but instinct. The same low warning that had been whispering beneath her skin since the moment she entered this room. She turned her head slightly, not enough to look at him directly, just enough to see the letter on the table from a different angle. And she read 3 words before she made herself look away. "Eliminate the girl." The latch was cold under her fingers. She pressed down on it carefully, quietly, the way she had pressed down on everything in this house for 3 years, with patience and precision and the absolute certainty that no one was watching her closely enough to notice. She closed the door behind her without a sound. The corridor was empty. Molly stood with her back against the oak paneling and breathed. Once. Twice. The lavender scent from her cloak drifted up faintly, and she held onto it like a rope. Eliminate the girl. Not see to her future. Not arrange her affairs. Eliminate. The marriage to Lord Fenwick was not a marriage. It was a delivery, a legal transaction that would move her far enough from this territory that whatever happened next could be blamed on distance, on illness, on misfortune. The northern reaches were cold and remote, and full of men who owed Devon favors. She would arrive there, and she would not survive the winter, and her death would be mourned with exactly the same sincerity as her parents had been. Her parents. The thought hit her like cold water. She had always believed, because she needed to believe, that their deaths had been an accident. A carriage on a mountain road, a broken axle, ice. She had been told the details so many times, in such careful language, that she had eventually stopped questioning them. She was questioning them now. Molly pushed herself off the wall and moved down the corridor with quiet, deliberate steps. Not running. Running would be noticed. She passed a servant carrying a tray of evening bread, nodded once, kept walking. She turned left at the stone arch, descended the narrow servant's stair, crossed the back courtyard where the horses shifted in their stalls, and the smell of hay and manure was sharp and real and grounding. She needed to think. She needed, more urgently, to leave. But she had no coin, no horse of her own, no family left who was not already in Devon's pocket, no allies within 3 days' ride. She was an Omega in a world that did not extend mercy to Omegas without a pack behind them, and her pack had been stripped from her before she was old enough to fight for it. She stood in the courtyard and looked up at the sky. The moon was 3/4 full, heavy and pale above the tree line, and something in her chest ached at the sight of it. A hollow, familiar ache, like a door with no room behind it. She had no wolf. She had never shifted. Whatever had been inside her at birth had gone quiet and stayed quiet, sealed away by something she did not understand and healers could not explain. In a kingdom where power lived in the shift, in the bond, in the strength of the wolf beneath the skin, Molly was considered broken, incomplete, a liability. Devon had known that when he took her in. He had counted on it. She pressed her hand flat against the cold stone of the courtyard wall and steadied herself. She could not run blind. She would not survive a night in the forest without a wolf and without provisions. But she could listen. She could plan. She could use the one gift she had that no one in this household had ever thought to fear. The fact that she moved through rooms so quietly that people forgot she was there. And people who forgot she was there said things they should not. She would go back inside. She would listen. And when she knew enough, she would run. It was past the second bell of night when she heard it. She had positioned herself in the narrow space behind the tapestry in the great hall, where a gap in the stonework allowed sound to travel from the adjoining council room with startling clarity. She had discovered this by accident at 14, and had used it perhaps a dozen times since, always carefully, always briefly. Tonight she stayed for a long time, Devon's voice first. Then another she did not immediately recognize, lower, rougher, with the particular cadence of the Northern Territories. The Lycan king has requested a tribute performance. His court assembles at the new moon. He expects entertainment from each of the 6 vassal lords. I am aware, Devon replied. I have already selected someone. A pause. The girl? She has a voice unlike anything I have heard. The king will be distracted. Long enough for our purposes. Something cold settled in Molly's stomach, but she held very still. And afterward? Devrin's answer came without hesitation and without feeling. Afterward, she will no longer be a concern. Molly stood behind the tapestry in the dark, the lavender scent faint around her, her hands completely steady, and understood with absolute clarity that she had perhaps 10 days left to live, unless she found a way to make the Lycan king himself her shield before they could use her as their weapon. The plan was either brilliant or the last mistake she would ever make. Molly had not yet decided which. She spent 3 days doing exactly what was expected of her, sitting quietly through meals she barely tasted, allowing Marta to measure her for new garments she had no intention of wearing to any wedding, nodding obediently when Devrin mentioned Lord Fenwick's estate, as though the name meant nothing more to her than a direction on a map. She smiled when smiling was required. She lowered her eyes when lowering her eyes kept suspicion at bay. She was, to all appearances, the same docile, unremarkable ward she had always been. At night, she planned. She had 2 things Devrin had never bothered to account for, because he had never considered her worth accounting for. The first was her voice. The second was the small iron key she had quietly taken from the hook beside the head housekeeper's door 3 years ago, when she first suspected that her room was occasionally searched in her absence. The key opened a narrow storage chamber at the base of the east tower, a forgotten space, dry and dark, where she had slowly, carefully, over months, stored what she needed: a rolled blanket, a pouch of dried provisions, a small purse of coin she had accumulated in careful increments, a copper here, a silver there, from the household accounts she was sometimes asked to transcribe when the steward was unwell. It was not much, but it was hers, and no one knew it existed. On the 4th day, a herald arrived from the royal court. He rode through the main gate in the gray morning light, his horse's breath misting in the cold air, the crowned wolf banner of King Aidan's house snapping above him in the wind. Molly watched from a window on the upper floor, her arms folded beneath her gray cloak, and felt something shift in the atmosphere of the entire household. Servants moved faster. Guards straightened. Even Devrin, who she observed crossing the courtyard below, carried himself with a particular tension in his shoulders that she had learned to read as concealed anxiety. The herald's message was delivered in the great hall, and Molly was not present for it. But she heard, through the usual channels of servants' whispers and corridor echoes, that the royal summons had arrived. The Lycan King's court would assemble in 9 days' time at Varenhold, the seat of the Northern Highland territories, 3 days' ride from Devrin's estate. Each vassal lord was to arrive with his household retinue, and such tribute and entertainment as befitted the occasion. Devrin sent for her before supper. "You will perform at the king's gathering," he told her, in the same tone he used for all instructions. Flat, final, not a request. "I have already informed the herald of your particular gift. The king has expressed interest." Molly kept her eyes down. "As you wish, my lord. You will conduct yourself with complete propriety. You will speak to no one of consequence without my presence. You will perform when called upon and remain with my household at all other times." He paused, and she felt his gaze on her, measuring. "Do you understand?" "Perfectly," she said. She left his study with her hands folded and her pulse steady, and allowed herself, only once she was alone in the east corridor, the smallest and most careful breath of relief. He was bringing her directly to the king. They departed 2 mornings later, in a procession that felt more like a military convoy than a noble household traveling to court. 4 covered wagons, 12 mounted guards, Devrin in a black riding coat on his dark horse at the front. Molly rode in the second wagon with Marta and 2 other serving women, wedged between a trunk of formal garments and a crate of wine sealed with wax. The wagon smelled of pine resin and horse, and the faint sweetness of the dried herbs Marta tucked into everything. The countryside rolled past the canvas opening in shades of brown and gray. It was late in the season, the trees stripped to their bones, the fields fallow, the sky the color of old pewter. Villages appeared and disappeared. Farmers watched the procession from the edges of their land, with the particular stillness of people who had learned not to draw attention from passing nobles. Molly watched them and thought about her brother. Owen had been 9 years old when their parents died. He was 12 now. Wherever he was. Devrin had arranged, within months of becoming her guardian, for Owen to be sent to a distant monastery for his education. In the mountains, 3 territories to the east. She had received 2 letters in 3 years, both brief, both clearly written under supervision. She did not know if he was well. She did not know if he was truly there at all. This was the thing she had not allowed herself to feel fully, because feeling it fully would have unmade her. But she felt it now, in the rocking dark of the wagon, with the smell of pine and cold air coming through the canvas, and Marta dozing against the opposite trunk. She felt it like a bruise that had been pressed carefully around for years and was now being pressed directly, deliberately. Owen was the reason she could not simply disappear into the forest and find her own way. Owen was somewhere, and Devrin knew where. And if she vanished without leverage, without protection, that knowledge would become a weapon. She needed the king, not as a rescuer, not as a hero arriving to solve her problems. She had no illusions about powerful men and what they typically wanted from women with no pack, no wolf, and no family left to negotiate on their behalf. But she needed his authority, his reach, the particular kind of safety that came from being, even temporarily, under the protection of someone that Devrin could not touch. She would perform, she would be heard, and she would find a way to speak. Varenhold rose out of the highland mist on the 3rd afternoon, like something carved from the mountain itself. Its walls were dark stone, iron gray, streaked with the rust of old rain. Towers rose at each corner, and banners hung heavy and still in the damp air. The crowned wolf on black repeated along the battlements until the castle seemed to wear it like a second skin. The road leading to the main gate was broad enough for 4 wagons abreast, flanked by torches already lit against the early dark, and the sound of hoofbeats and iron-rimmed wheels on stone echoed up into the cold sky. Molly stepped down from the wagon in the main courtyard and pulled her gray cloak tighter. The air here smelled different from Devrin's estate, cleaner, colder, with an undertone of pine smoke and something else, something mineral and deep, like stone after rain. Around her, the household organized itself with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to following orders. Trunks were unloaded, horses were led away, guards were assigned quarters in the outer barracks. She stayed close to the wagon's shadow until Marta appeared at her elbow. "Come," the older woman said quietly. "The women's quarters are in the west corridor. Lord Devrin says we are not to wander." Molly nodded and followed. The interior of Varenhold was immense and spare, the way all places of real power tended to be. No excess, no decoration for its own sake, only stone and iron and candlelight, and the particular weight of a space that had witnessed centuries of consequence. Her boots were quiet on the flagstone floors. Tapestries in dark reds and golds hung at intervals along the corridor walls, depicting hunting scenes and battles and the Great Shift. A wolf mid-transformation beneath a full moon, rendered in such detail that the artist must have seen it happen. She paused in front of that tapestry for just a moment. The wolf in it was enormous, its eyes pale, its posture utterly still despite the violence of the shift itself. There was something in its expression. If a wolf mid-shift could be said to have an expression, that was not rage and not pain. It was closer to clarity. The absolute animal clarity of something that had shed everything unnecessary. She had never felt that. Had never shifted. Never felt the wolf rise. Never known what it was to carry that second self inside her chest. The healers said her wolf was dormant. The crueler ones said it was dead. Devran had once referred to it, in front of guests, as her deficiency, the way one might refer to a lame horse, with a kind of dismissive practicality that made the cruelty harder to name. Marta's hand touched her elbow gently. "Molly." She turned from the tapestry and walked on. That night, lying on a narrow bed in the stone-walled chamber assigned to Devrin's female household. Listening to Marta's quiet breathing and the distant sound of wind against the high window, Molly made herself go through the plan one more time. The performance would be held on the third evening of the gathering. She would sing. Devrin expected her voice to be the distraction, the gilded thing that occupied the king's attention, while whatever business was transacted quietly at the edges of the hall. He expected her to be beautiful and empty, a sound without a mind behind it. He had made the same mistake everyone made. He had forgotten that she listened, and she had been listening for 3 years, storing things, keeping things, learning the particular language of men who believed they were not being observed. She knew dates, names, transactions, debts. She knew things about Devrin's arrangements with Lord Fenwick that would be of considerable interest to a king who valued order in his vassal territories. She knew about the letter with the crowned wolf seal. She knew about the words, "Eliminate the girl," and what had been meant by them, and who had written them, and why. She would sing for the king, and when the last note settled into silence, she would find a way to speak to him alone. What happened after that was in the hands of the moon. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice. She did not hear him speak that first evening, not directly. What she heard was the silence that preceded him. The way an entire hall full of nobles, guards, servants, and visiting lords went quietly, collectively still the moment the doors at the far end of the great hall opened, and King Aidan of the Lycantian throne walked through them. Molly was seated with Devrin's household retinue along the left wall, third row back, positioned precisely where she would be visible enough to be called forward when needed, and invisible enough not to require management before that moment. She had been watching the hall fill for the better part of an hour. The rival lords with their careful posturing, the court officials in their formal dark tunics, the guards in their black and iron livery stationed at every pillar like pieces on a war table. She had been cataloging exits, noting faces, measuring distances the way she had learned to measure everything in Devrin's house. Quietly, precisely, with the knowledge that the details other people overlooked were often the only resources available to someone in her position. Then the doors opened, and the hall went still. King Aidan walked like a man who had never once in his life needed to announce himself. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than the doorframe comfortably suggested, dressed in black leather armor crossed with dark straps and a wolf fur mantle that sat heavy across his back. His hair was long, black, pulled back in tight braids that fell past his shoulders, and his eyes, even at this distance, even across the length of the torchlit hall, were a pale and startling blue that seemed to catch the light and hold it differently than everything else in the room. There was a scar on his jaw, faint but visible. A line that ran from just below his left cheekbone toward his chin, silver pale against his skin. She did not know why she noticed it first, before the crown, before the posture, before the controlled authority that radiated from him like heat from banked coals, but she noticed it and filed it away, the way she filed everything. He took his seat at the high table without ceremony and without haste. A servant poured wine. He did not look at it. He looked at the room. His gaze moved across the assembled company with the particular quality of someone who was not performing the act of surveying. He was actually seeing. There was a difference, and Molly recognized it because she did the same thing, though from considerably less power. His eyes moved from face to face with calm deliberation, and she had the unsettling impression that he was not simply counting lords and guards and retinues. He was reading something else, something beneath the surface of the room. His gaze passed over Devrin's section of the hall. For a fraction of a moment, so brief she almost convinced herself she had imagined it, those pale blue eyes settled, not on Devrin, but on her. Then they moved on. Molly looked down at her folded hands and breathed carefully through her nose. The evening's formal proceedings lasted until the second bell of night. There were speeches, pledges of fealty renewed in the old tongue, the presentation of tribute gifts from each vassal lord, bolts of silk, casks of aged wine, bound volumes from distant territories, a hunting falcon hooded in red leather. Devrin presented a carved ivory box containing a set of navigational instruments worked in silver, and the king received it with the same expression he had worn since entering the hall. Attentive, composed, unreadable. The entertainment came after the formal meal. A troupe of acrobats from the southern reaches performed first, then a pair of musicians with string instruments that filled the vaulted stone ceiling with something aching and intricate. The hall had relaxed by then, wine flowing, conversation resuming beneath the music. The tension of formal ceremony softened into something approaching ease. Devrin leaned toward her. "You are next," he said quietly. "Remember what I told you. You sing, nothing more. You smile if the king addresses you, and you defer to me for any response." "Of course," she said. A court official called her name a few minutes later. Molly rose, smoothed the front of her linen dress, pale gray, simple, the most modest garment Marta had packed for her, which she had chosen deliberately, and walked to the open space before the high table. The hall did not go silent for her the way it had for the king. Conversations continued at the edges. Someone laughed near the far wall. She was, to most of the room, a minor entertainment, a ward of a minor lord, unremarkable. She stood in the torchlight with her hands at her sides and her golden braid over one shoulder, and she looked just once, directly at the king. He was watching her with that same quiet attention he had given the room earlier. Not hungry, not dismissive, simply present, waiting. She opened her mouth and sang. It was an old song, a lament from the Highland territories sung in the old tongue, about a woman who waits at the edge of a dark forest for someone who does not return. Molly had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from hers, and the melody was the kind that seemed to exist in the body, rather than in memory. It rose without effort, without performance, shaped entirely by something truer than technique. The hall went quiet. Not gradually, the way it sometimes did when entertainment was pleasant. Quickly, the way a room goes quiet when something unexpected occurs. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The laughing near the far wall stopped. Even the servants paused in their movement, trays held still, heads turned. Molly kept her eyes forward and sang. She was aware, in the way she was always aware of everything, of King Aidan's stillness at the high table. He had set down his wine cup. His hands were flat on the table surface. He was not moving at all, and the expression on his face had changed in a way she could not fully name from this distance. It was not the composed unreadability of before. Something had shifted behind his eyes, something that looked, from where she stood, remarkably like recognition. She finished the final verse. The last note rose to the stone ceiling and dissolved into silence. For 3 full seconds, no one in the hall made a sound. Then the applause began, and the room came back to itself, and Molly lowered her head in a brief bow and turned to walk back to her seat. A voice stopped her. "Wait." It was quiet, that word. Not raised, not commanding in the way that needed volume to enforce itself. But it stopped every movement in her body with the absolute efficiency of someone who had never needed to repeat himself. She turned back. King Aidan had risen from his seat. He stood at the edge of the high table, and the torchlight caught the braids in the fur mantle and the pale scar on his jaw, and he was looking at her, fully, directly, without the careful distance of court propriety. "Come forward," he said. She walked toward him. She kept her pace even. Behind her, she could feel Devrin's attention on her back like a hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades. She stopped 3 feet from the edge of the high table and met the king's eyes. This close, the blue of them was startling. Not cold, as she had expected, but layered, the way deep water is layered, different shades at different depths. He was studying her face with an intensity that was not unkind, but was entirely unguarded, and it was the unguarded quality of it that unsettled her most, because it was not what powerful men usually showed women they had just met. "What is your name?" he asked. "Molly, Your Majesty, ward of Lord Devrin of the East March." Something flickered in his expression at the word ward. Brief, controlled, gone almost before it registered. "That song," he said. "Where did you learn it?" "From my mother, Your Majesty. She learned it from hers." "Your mother." A pause. "What was her name?" The question was oddly specific, and Molly felt the first faint thread of something she could not immediately identify. Not danger, not comfort, but something in between, like standing at the edge of a pool and not yet knowing the depth. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah of the Ashvale line." The silence that followed was exactly 3 heartbeats long. Then King Aidan said, very quietly, "The Ashvale line was declared extinct 12 years ago." "Yes," Molly said, holding his gaze with everything she had. "I know." Something moved behind those blue eyes. His jaw tightened once, a small and controlled movement, and he looked at her, not the way men looked at women in great halls, calculating worth, or measuring beauty, or mapping use. He looked at her the way someone looks at a locked door, when they have just realized they might have the key. "You will remain in the castle," he said. The words were addressed to her, but the weight of them landed across the entire hall, and every person in the room understood, without being told, that this was not an invitation. It was a declaration. He turned to Devon, who had risen from his seat with an expression of careful neutrality that did not quite reach his eyes. "Your ward will be housed in the castle's east quarters for the duration of the gathering. I have questions that require answers." Devon's smile was a masterpiece of practiced grace. "Of course, Your Majesty. It would be our honor." Molly stood between them and felt the shape of the trap she had built for herself, or the door she had just managed to open, depending entirely on what King Aidan of the Lycantian throne intended to do with what she had just handed him. She had said one true thing in a room full of careful lies. Now she would find out if truth was enough to keep her alive. The east quarters of Varenhold were nothing like the room she had occupied at Devon's estate. The bed had a carved oak frame and curtains of deep burgundy wool, heavy enough to hold warmth through a winter night. A fire had been laid in the hearth before her arrival, and the room smelled of pine smoke and beeswax, and the faint sweetness of dried rosemary tucked into the window linens. A copper basin sat on a stand near the wall, filled with water that was still warm. There was a writing table with good candles, a chest for garments, and a window that looked out over the castle's inner courtyard, rather than a servant's alley. Molly stood in the center of the room for a long moment, and simply breathed. Marta had been permitted to accompany her, which was the one concession Devon had managed to negotiate, before King Aidan's chamberlain had quietly but immovably redirected the rest of Devon's household retinue to the outer guest quarters on the far side of the castle. The separation had been handled with impeccable courtesy and absolute firmness, the way all truly effective maneuvers were handled, so graciously that objecting to it would have revealed more than anyone wished to reveal. Marta set down the small traveling trunk and looked around the room with the careful expression of a woman recalibrating her understanding of the situation. "Well," she said after a moment. "Yes," Molly agreed. She did not sleep much that night. The summons came the following morning, carried by a guard in the king's black livery, who knocked at precisely the hour when the castle's chapel bell rang for the morning service. The guard was polite, formal, and did not wait for her to deliberate. Molly dressed in her gray linen dress and her wool cloak, braided her hair with steady hands, and followed him. She was taken not to the great hall, but to a smaller room she had not seen the night before, a council chamber off the main corridor, oak-paneled, with a long table and a cold hearth, and maps pinned to a wooden frame along one wall. Morning light came through 2 narrow windows, gray and clean, and fell across a desk at the far end where King Aidan stood with his back to her, reading something. The guard withdrew and closed the door. She waited. After a moment, the king set down the document he had been reading and turned. He was dressed differently from the night before, simpler, more functional. Dark tunic, leather bracers, no mantle. The braids were pulled back from his face. Without the formal armor and the torchlight of the great hall, he was still unmistakably what he was. But the quality of his presence was different, less ceremonial, more direct. He studied her for a moment, and she held his gaze with the same stillness she had learned to hold everything. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. She sat. He did not, immediately. He moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard below, and she had the impression that he was organizing something. Not thoughts, exactly, but the order in which he intended to present them. "The Ashvale line," he said without turning. "Tell me what you know about it." "My mother was Sarah Ashvale, youngest daughter of Lord Callan Ashvale of the Northern Highlands. When I was 10 years old, the Ashvale holdings were seized following my grandfather's death. The family was declared extinct by order of the Territorial Council." She paused. "I later learned that the extinction declaration was filed before my grandfather died, by approximately 3 months. Now he turned. His expression was controlled, but something behind his eyes had sharpened considerably. "You have documentation of this?" "No. The records I found were burned before I could secure copies. But I know who filed the declaration, and I know which council members signed it, and I know that Lord Devon of the Eastmarch was the primary beneficiary of the Ashvale land seizure." She kept her voice level. "He was also named my guardian 4 days after my parents' deaths. My parents, who died in a carriage accident on a road they had traveled without incident for 15 years. The silence in the room had a particular quality to it, the quality of something that has been still for a long time and is now deciding whether to move. "You have been in his household for 3 years, Aiden said. "Yes." "And you said nothing." "I had no one to say it to." She met his eyes. "Until now." He looked at her for a long moment. Not with suspicion, she thought, though suspicion would have been reasonable. With something more careful than that. The particular attention of someone who had learned, through long experience, to distinguish between performance and truth. "Why tell me?" he asked. "You do not know me. You have no reason to trust me." "No," she agreed. "But I have very specific reasons not to trust anyone else. And I am running out of time in which to find alternatives." She folded her hands in her lap. "Devon intends to send me to Lord Fenwick of the Northern Reaches. He has signed a marriage contract without my knowledge or consent. I do not believe I will survive that journey." Something moved across Aiden's face, brief, controlled, but unmistakable. His jaw tightened once, the same small movement she had seen the night before. "You believe he means to have you killed." "I know he does. I read part of a letter in his study, before I was aware he was watching." The words were clear enough. She held his gaze. "I am telling you this not because I expect rescue. I am telling you because the Ashvale lands and the fraudulent extinction declaration are matters that fall under royal jurisdiction, and because Devon's arrangements with Lord Fenwick involve the transfer of territories that border your own holdings in the north." She paused. "I thought you might find that relevant." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that, but present. "You thought correctly," he said. He moved away from the window and sat down across from her, forearms resting on the table, and the shift in posture changed something in the room, made it smaller, more immediate, more honest. "I need you to tell me everything," he said. "Names, dates, every conversation you recall, every document you have seen, even those you could not secure." His voice was even. "Can you do that?" "Yes," she said, "but I need something in exchange." His expression did not change, but she felt his attention sharpen. "My brother," she said. "Owen. He is 12 years old and he was sent to a monastery in the eastern mountains 3 years ago. I have not had reliable word of him since. I need to know he is safe, and I need him out of Devon's reach before any action is taken that might prompt Devon to use him as leverage." Aiden was quiet for a moment. "His full name," he said. "Owen Ashvale, though Devon likely registered him under a different name." He nodded once, slowly. I will send riders today. Something cracked open in her chest at those 4 words, quietly, without drama, the way ice cracks in early thaw. Barely audible, but irreversible. She had held herself together for so long, with such careful precision, that she had almost forgotten there were things underneath the holding. The thought of Owen, small and serious and 10 years old, waving from a monastery gate, surfaced suddenly and completely, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the window for a moment, until she was certain her face was her own again. When she looked back, Aiden was watching her with an expression that was impossible to read fully, but that held, she thought, not pity. She would not have borne pity, but recognition. The particular recognition of someone who understood what it cost to hold something that long. "Tell me everything," he said again, quietly this time. Not a command, something closer to permission. So she did. She spoke for the better part of 2 hours. He listened without interrupting, without reacting visibly to anything she said, only occasionally asking brief and precise questions that told her, clearly, that he was not simply hearing her, but organizing what he heard into something actionable. By the time she finished, the morning light had shifted to midday gray, and a servant had brought a tray of bread and salted meat and warmed cider that sat mostly untouched between them. When she stopped speaking, the room was very quiet. "You understand," Aiden said carefully, "that what you have described constitutes treason against the crown. The fraudulent land seizure, the falsified extinction declaration, the unsanctioned marriage contract. These are not merely crimes against your family. They are violations of territorial law that fall directly under my authority to prosecute." "I understand," she said. "Devrin will deny everything. He has allies on the Territorial Council and years of carefully maintained credibility." He looked at her steadily. "This will not be simple. I know. He will attempt to discredit you. He will call you unstable, grief-addled, an omega, without a wolf making desperate claims to protect herself from a lawful guardianship arrangement." A pause. "He will say you are nothing." The words landed with the precision of something that had been aimed, but not at her. At the version of her that Devrin had spent 3 years trying to create. She felt them without flinching. "He has been saying that for 3 years," she said. "He was wrong then. He will be wrong now." Aiden held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Yes, he will." It was not a grand declaration. It was not a promise laden with ceremony or sentiment. It was simply 3 words spoken with the absolute, unhesitating certainty of someone who did not say things he did not mean, and it settled into her chest with a weight she had not expected. She looked down at her hands. They were still folded in her lap, still composed, still giving nothing away. But something beneath that composure had shifted, slightly and significantly, the way a door shifts when someone on the other side leans against it. Not open yet, but no longer entirely closed. She did not trust him. She was not capable of trust, not yet. Not after 3 years of learning what trust cost. But she was beginning to believe that he was, at minimum, something different from what she had known. And in her current circumstances, different was enough to hold on to. The riders Aiden sent east returned on the 5th day. Molly was in the castle library when she heard the hoofbeats in the courtyard below. 4 horses, moving fast. The particular rhythm of riders who had not stopped for comfort. She set down the volume she had been attempting to read and went to the window. The afternoon light was thin and cold, the kind that came before early snow, and the courtyard stones were wet from morning rain. She watched the riders dismount, watched a guard move quickly toward the main keep. Watched, without allowing herself to feel anything yet, because feeling before knowing was a luxury she had learned she could not afford. Aiden sent for her 20 minutes later. She walked to the council chamber with steady steps and told herself, quietly and firmly, that whatever came through that door, she would receive standing. She had received everything else standing. She would receive this too. Aiden was already there when she arrived. He was standing beside the table, not behind it, and that small shift in position told her something before he spoke. He had a letter in his hand, unfolded, and he looked at her with an expression that was careful in the way of someone delivering something that cuts both ways. "He is alive," he said. The breath left her body all at once. She put one hand on the back of the nearest chair, not sitting, just steadying, and pressed her lips together until she was certain her voice would hold. "Where?" she managed. "Not the monastery." His jaw was tight. "He was moved 14 months ago. He has been held in a fortified estate in the Eastern Territories belonging to a man named Lord Crest, one of Devrin's oldest allies. He is unharmed, but he is not free." The cold that moved through her was different from the cold she had felt reading Devrin's letter, different from the cold of the courtyard at night, different from every variety of cold she had catalogued in 3 years of living without warmth. This was something older and sharper, the cold of understanding the full shape of something you had been trying not to see clearly. Devrin had not simply stored Owen away. He had kept him, deliberately, carefully, in a location that could be used, that had always been intended to be used, as a mechanism of control if she ever became inconvenient. She had been right to come here. She had been right about all of it. And that rightness felt nothing like satisfaction. "When can your riders reach him?" she asked. "They are already moving," Aiden said. "I sent the order before I called for you." She looked up at him. "I told you I would send riders," he said simply. "I did not specify only to look." Something in her chest did a thing she was not prepared for. She looked away, at the window, at the gray afternoon light, at the wet stones of the courtyard, where the horses were still being led to the stables. She breathed through it carefully. It was not grief, and it was not gratitude exactly, though it contained elements of both. It was something more complicated, the particular vertigo of discovering that a person has done what they said they would do, when you had organized your entire existence around the expectation that people would not. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "Molly." She turned back. He was watching her with those layered blue eyes, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had seen it, not the composed authority of the great hall, not the precise attention of their first conversation. Something beneath all of that, something that did not perform itself. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it without running from it." She went still. "I am listening." He set the letter on the table. He seemed, for a moment, to be choosing his words with unusual care. Not because he was uncertain of them, she thought, but because he understood the weight they would carry for her specifically. "The night you sang," he said, "I recognized the melody before you finished the first verse. I know that song. I heard it once, many years ago, when I traveled through the Highland territories as a young man. A woman sang it at an inn near the Ashvale border." He paused. She had golden hair and a daughter of perhaps 7 or 8 years old sitting at her feet. The child had the same hair, the same voice, already forming. The air in the room seemed to change. "My mother," Molly said. It was not a question. "I believe so." He held her gaze. "I did not connect it, in the moment. Not until you said her name. Sarah of the Ashvale line." Something moved across his face, old and quiet. "She was kind to me. I was traveling without my full retinue. Young, trying to understand the territories I would one day rule. And I stopped at that inn during a storm. She brought me warm cider without being asked, and did not treat me differently when she learned who I was." A pause. "I have thought of her occasionally over the years, the way one thinks of moments of unexpected grace. I did not know she had died." Molly was quiet for a long moment. She would have appreciated that, she said finally, being remembered for cider rather than for her bloodline. Something crossed his face that was almost a smile, brief and real, the kind that does not prepare itself in advance. Then it settled into something more serious. "There is something else," he said. "Something I have not told you because I was not certain how to say it, and because I did not want it to change the way you heard everything else." He met her eyes directly. "From the moment you stood before my table and sang, my wolf has not been quiet. Not once. In 20 years of ruling this kingdom, I have never felt this bond pull toward anyone. I am telling you this not to compel you, not to claim anything over you. I am telling you because you deserve the truth of it, and because you have shown me, in 2 days, that you can handle truth better than most people handle comfort." The word bond landed in the room between them and sat there, neither of them reaching for it yet. Molly looked at him for a long time. She thought about Devrin's study and the smell of burnt tallow. She thought about 3 years of smallness and silence, and learning to occupy as little space as possible. She thought about Owen at 12 years old in a fortified estate that was not a monastery. She thought about her mother singing at an inn during a storm, bringing cider to a young king who had not yet become what he was, and being kind without agenda. She thought about the tapestry in the corridor, and the wolf mid-shift with clarity in its eyes. "I do not know what my wolf is," she said. "I have never shifted." The healer said, "I know what they said." His voice was quiet. "They were wrong." She looked at him. "An omega without a wolf does not have the voice you have," he said. "That melody you sang carries the resonance of a Highland Pack's moon call. It is not a human sound, Molly. It never was. Whatever is inside you is not gone. It has been waiting. A pause. Perhaps for the same reasons you have been waiting." The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the afternoon light through the windows was fading toward the gray of early evening. In the courtyard below, a torch was being lit. She could smell the smoke of it through the old stone walls, faint and warm. She did not reach for him. She was not ready for that, and she thought he knew it. And the fact that he had not moved toward her even now, even after saying what he had said, settled something in her that she had not realized was still braced. "What happens to Devrin?" she asked. His expression shifted back into the composed authority she had first seen in the great hall. But it sat differently now. She could see both things at once, the king and the man, and she did not have to choose which one was real. "He will be summoned before the full council tomorrow morning," Aiden said. "The evidence you have provided, combined with the writer's findings regarding Owen's location, constitutes sufficient cause for immediate seizure of his holdings and arrest pending trial. The falsified Ashvale Extinction Declaration will be formally reversed. Your family's lands will be held in trust by the Crown until the legal process is complete." He met her eyes. "You will be present. You will be heard. Devrin will not be permitted to speak over you or for you." Something she had carried for a very long time set itself down. The council convened at dawn. Devrin arrived with the careful composure of a man who had survived many difficult mornings and expected to survive this one. He looked at Molly, seated at the council table to the king's left, and something moved through his expression. Surprise, quickly suppressed, then a harder calculation. He did not have time to finish calculating. Aiden spoke first, and spoke without raising his voice, and what he said was precise and complete, and left no angles from which a defense could be constructed. The evidence was presented. The writer's testimony regarding Owen's location was read aloud. The letter with the words, "Eliminate the girl," was produced, recovered from Devrin's document trunk in the outer guest quarters by the king's guard the night before, while Devrin slept unaware that his carefully managed world was already dismantled. Devrin denied everything with impressive fluency until the letter was placed in front of him. After that, he said very little. His holdings were seized before the morning meal. He was taken to the castle's lower cells pending transfer to the royal court for formal trial, which concluded 3 weeks later with a ruling that stripped him of his title, his lands, and his freedom for the remainder of his natural life. Lord Fenwick, faced with the collapse of his arrangement and the sudden interest of the crown in his northern dealings, quietly dissolved the unsigned marriage contract and retreated to his estate, where he lived out his remaining years in careful anonymity, never again reaching for things that did not belong to him. Owen arrived at Varenhold 12 days after the council, thin and pale from months of insufficient sunlight, with a wariness in his eyes that broke something in Molly's chest. And then, slowly, over the days that followed, began to heal. He was quieter than she remembered. He was also, she discovered, deeply funny in the dry and understated way of someone who has learned to find humor as a survival mechanism, a quality she recognized immediately because she had learned it the same way. He liked Aidan, which she had not expected, and which mattered to her more than she anticipated. The Ashvile lands were formally restored to the family name 4 months after the council. The restoration ceremony was held in the Great Hall at Varenhold, in the same torchlit space where Molly had stood with her hands at her sides and sung a Highland lament to a king who had not yet told her that he recognized her voice from a storm night memory of her mother. She stood there again now, in the same hall, in a dress the color of deep winter blue, rather than pale gray linen, her golden braid pinned up for the first time in her memory, with small silver pieces worked in the shape of climbing wolves. Owen stood to her left, taller than she had expected him to be, his jaw set with the particular dignity of someone reclaiming something long owed. The council members were arrayed along the walls. The same great table stretched before them, the same stone ceiling vaulting above. Aidan stood at the head of the table, and when he looked at her across the length of the hall, it was with the same expression she had come to know over 4 months of slow and careful mornings, council sessions where she sat at the table and was heard, evenings where Owen fell asleep by the library fire, and she and Aidan remained talking in the low light until the candles burned short. Long walks along the castle's inner walls, where the wind came off the highlands and smelled of pine and cold stone, and he never once told her what to feel or when to feel it. He had kept every word he had said, not with gestures or ceremony, but in the accumulated weight of consistent, unhesitating presence. She had stopped bracing, somewhere in the 3rd month. She had not noticed the exact moment it happened, which she thought was probably how it was supposed to happen. After the restoration ceremony, when the hall had cleared, and Owen had gone to bed, and the servants had taken the last of the candles, she found Aidan in the council chamber, the same room where she had first told him everything, where he had said, "I will send riders today," and change the entire direction of her life. He was standing at the window, looking out at the courtyard, and he turned when she entered, with the ease of someone who had expected her. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The fire was low, and the room was warm, and smelled of pine smoke and old parchment. And outside the window the moon was full and white and enormous above the highland tree line. She felt something stir in her chest, deep, instinctive, wordless. The thing that had been sealed and silent and waiting since before she could remember. It moved like a tide moving, like a door finally finding the space to open, slow and inevitable, and without violence. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. "It is not gone," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "No," Aidan said, "just that." But his eyes held everything else. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, and they looked out at the moon together. And she did not reach for his hand, but her shoulder was close enough to his arm that she could feel the warmth of him, and he did not move away. "I am not afraid of it anymore," she said. "The bond." He was quiet for a moment. "I know." "I am choosing it," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because it was fated, not because the wolf decided before I could, because I am choosing it, myself." He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face, the unguarded, unhurried, deeply certain expression of a man who had waited without demanding, was the most honest thing she had seen in her life. "I know that too," he said. "It is the only way I wanted it." She looked up at him for a long moment, And then she did something she had not done in longer than she could accurately remember. She let her hands fall open at her sides. She let her shoulders drop. She let herself be exactly where she was, without managing it, without measuring it, without holding any part of herself in reserve against the possibility of loss. The moon sat heavy and full above the highlands. Somewhere in the east corridor, Owen slept peacefully in a warm room with a fire and a door that no one locked. Devrin sat in a cell 3 territories away, stripped of every false thing he had built, and would never reach for her again. Her wolf, slow and certain as a tide, finally came home. And in the great stone castle above the highland forest, with the smell of pine smoke in the air, and a king who had learned her voice before he ever saw her face, standing close enough that she could feel his warmth, Molly Ashvale, daughter of Sarah, sister of Owen, heir to a name that was no longer buried, breathed in and breathed out, and was, at last, completely whole. This is where their story ends, not in fire or tragedy, but in the quiet certainty of 2 people who chose each other fully, with open eyes and unbroken will. Owen grew into a steady and perceptive young lord, eventually taking his place as head of the restored Ashvale Holdings, with the kind of quiet authority that reminded everyone who knew him of his sister. Aidan ruled his kingdom with the same unhesitating clarity he had always carried, but those who served him noted, without ever saying so directly, that he laughed more easily now, and that the council chamber no longer felt like a room built purely for war. And Molly, once invisible, once reduced to a voice without a name, stood beside him as his chosen mate and queen, not because destiny had placed her there, but because she had walked through every dark corridor, told every dangerous truth, and arrived at that place entirely on her own terms. The Highlands remembered the Ashvale name again, and the name remembered itself.